Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing a review of The Ruin of Kings by Jenn Lyons. This is a book that I heard some mixed things about, although it came out recently, I think last year, with a lot of hype, and I had some kind of mixed reactions to it as well, so I'll be sharing my thoughts. At first, I saw a lot of hype and praise for this book, and it seemed like it had a pretty big marketing budget as well. There are a lot of quotes from famous authors talking about how great it was. And then I also saw a lot of reviews from people saying it was kind of unnecessarily convoluted and maybe, overhyped. So I was really curious to find out what I was going to think, and I thought the cover was very appealing, and, it did sound very interesting. So yeah, in the end, I feel like, in a way, both the hype and the mixed reviews are both justified. The thing with this book is that I was completely hooked from the first page. So that got me really, really excited because I don't think I've had a book that pulled me in that quickly for a while. And especially, I feel like I've been struggling to get into series, to start new series recently. So I was very, very excited at the beginning and just, couldn't put it down, basically. And then I'll talk more about, my reactions to it, but basically then I felt like there was this section in the middle where it felt like it was all just going to fall apart for me. And then actually at the end, I felt like it wrapped up pretty well, and I do feel enthusiastic enough about it to try reading at least the next one and to continue with the series. So it was kind of a mixed bag for me in the end. This will be a spoiler-free review. There will be a point at which I'm going to mention a few plot devices that get used in a general way, so I'll say when that is, so if you want to avoid really all spoilers, you can skip that. But other than that, this should be spoiler-free. I feel like preparing to talk about this book is the kind of experience that made me re-look up the difference between the words complex and complicated to make sure I was using the right one. And to be honest, I'm still not sure exactly what I would categorize this book as. Probably more complicated than complex. I don't know even whether to call it non-traditional fantasy or just traditional fantasy with some twists and style elements. But the style was something that really got me hooked onto this book from the beginning. That was what really drew me in. The premise does feel kind of traditional with a twist. It feels kind of like a chosen one lost heir story gone wrong. You have Kieran, the main character, who is an orphan. He's a thief. He has, a few magical abilities, and he is a long-lost son of a noble family. Unfortunately, they turn out to be not a very nice family. There are some traditional fantasy beats that this story hits, but there's also a lot of things in it that don't go the way you would expect. The way this is set up is very different. There's a frame story in which Kieran is imprisoned somewhere, and his jailer, Talon, starts asking him to tell his own story. So he starts telling his story in first person, starting from a certain point in the narrative, where he decides to start telling it to her. But then she cuts in the next chapter and is like, no, I'm going to tell your story back at the beginning. So there is also a third-person narrative. It's a third-person omniscient, but it's mostly focusing on Kieran from an earlier point. So you have basically two parallel narratives in this book about the same character from different points of view that move forward in time, both of them at, a similar pace, I guess. So there are things that are referenced in the later first-person narrative that haven't happened yet in the earlier one, and there's a lot of confusion with that. I thought it was fascinating. I thought that was such a cool idea, and I think it's something that's hard to pull off well, but when the author does a good job of manipulating those two storylines, it actually can make the reveals that much better. The other weird thing about this is that Talon is a mimic, so she basically if she kills and kind of eats somebody, she then has their memories, and she can shapeshift both into people she hasn't killed, but even more convincingly, she can take the place of people she has killed. So there are a lot of characters in this book that she has killed, and so she's able to tell the story from the point of view of anyone that she has eaten. So there are all these moments where she starts telling from someone's perspective, and Kieran's like, wait, you killed that person too? Seriously? So that's kind of another interesting element in here, right? Who is Talon? Who has she killed? And you find out at different points, but it also adds a little bit of other point of views in there as well in kind of a unique way. There are also footnotes throughout by not really a narrator, but a character who is a minor character that becomes sort of important at the end. You don't really know who he is for the entire book, but like, you know, he has to have something to do with this plot. And his footnotes are very, I guess I'd call them snarky. He does a lot of saying that both Talon and Kieran don't really know what they're talking about, correcting their scholarship, saying, you know, if they had studied the way I've studied, then they would know this is all wrong. So I kind of enjoyed that a lot as well. I like footnotes. Some people hate footnotes. If you hate footnotes, you probably won't like this book. At the beginning of Kieran's story, like where he picks up the narrative, he is getting sold as a slave. He has had part of his soul removed into this stone, which basically makes him an even more desirable slave, because whoever has that talisman can order him to do whatever they want him to do, and he has to obey. This is one of the many major plot devices in this story. And then he's being sold at a slave market, and two mysterious parties start bidding on him. They both seem to want him for their own reasons, and it seems like he's really, really important, but he doesn't know why, and you don't really know why. So that's where the narrative starts. But then when Talon starts telling the story, it goes back to when Kieran was a thief not really on the streets, but he was the adopted son of a blind musician, and he's stealing to earn money, and he ends up getting, who knows, maybe framed, but he goes to rob a house that's supposed to be deserted by the noble occupants, and instead he basically stumbles on a conspiracy there. He overhears something he shouldn't, and that kicks off a whole chain of events that basically start everything that happens in this book. So those are the two starts, and those two narratives go through basically until the very, very climax of the book, and you get information from each that kind of makes sense in the other eventually. That part, like I said, I like that kind of thing, and I think it was handled pretty well. That actually made me excited to read the book, but there is sort of a risk when you have this kind of complicated setup that it might not pay off. And that's how I started feeling in the middle of the book. I loved the confusion of this book at the beginning, but then at a certain point, the confusion kind of reaches a critical mass, and all these different elements are getting used. And I want to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to mention some specific plot devices that get used. So this is kind of, I guess it's like general spoilers. I don't really consider it to be spoilers because I'm not going to tell you who or what specifically. I'll just mention a few things, but if you really like to avoid anything that could possibly be construed as a spoiler, I will give you a timestamp for when I finish talking about this. So there's one MacGuffin magic item in this book that basically, I won't say how, but basically allows people to swap bodies. There are multiple characters, minor or major, that have swapped bodies at some point in the past, so you have that. And then you also have a huge number of characters that were not fathered by or mothered by the people that everyone thinks they were. And then sometimes those are the same characters that are swapping bodies. And then at a certain point, you start getting past lives. And you know, at a certain point, you're getting all these reveals of body swaps and past lives and parentage. And it's a lot. And I feel like it's probably one of those situations where the author has probably had this in her head for so long, and she really cares about these characters, and probably each reveal to her was super cool, where for me, I feel like one reveal would have been super cool, but we got like 20. And at a certain point, I couldn't even remember what got revealed to me earlier in the book. It was a lot. It was too much. And it felt like the whole middle section of the book was just reveals. So that's where it kind of lost me. I was like, oh, this isn't going to be what I want it to be. I feel like the middle section of this book kind of turned into a bit of a mess with all these nesting doll reveals, and it's really hard to pull off some of those things in a way that makes the reader care, especially when there's so many of them. But just when I thought all was lost and I was feeling really disappointed in this book and sort of forcing myself to just get through to the end, and it's hard because it started out so well. I was so excited about it. I did not want it to be a bad book. So just when I thought all was lost, I actually really enjoyed the ending. I felt like things kind of picked up again, and I liked the characters. I liked some things that got introduced, and I liked the setup for the next book, even though I feel like I have no idea what's going to happen in the next book. But it sort of saved itself, not through all those plot devices, but in spite of them. So I'm definitely going to read at least one more book in this series, but that whole convoluted mess of a middle was just a lot. This is kind of ironic because I just filmed a video about how I try to be nice in my reviews, and I'm not sure I'm being nice today, but I mean, I've said a lot of nice things about the book, right? I'm definitely not done with this series yet. It is supposed to be 5 books long, I think, and I think the books are coming out every 6 months, which, you know, as fans of epic fantasy know, that's not so common. I have no idea. Like, if this is a setup book, I don't know what the rest of the series is going to be, but I appreciated it. Didn't feel like it was just a book of setting things up without action. It was just the whole middle stuff and backstory. I don't know. That was a lot. So now that I talked about my experience a lot, I'll just tell a few more general things about it. I thought the world building was pretty strong. It wasn't like a generic Euro fantasy kind of book. It felt pretty unique. I feel like in tone, I feel like this is a book that kind of like sticks its toes into the waters of grimdark without fully grimdarking, which I'm quite fine with, actually. I don't need really grimdark stuff to enjoy it. But there are a lot of dark themes and dark things that happen in this. It's not just like unrelentingly brutal, though. I feel like Kieran as a main character is his personality is kind of noble. So in that way, it's not a super morally gray book. I feel like there were a lot of different cultures represented, and you do get a really good feel for the depth of this world and some of the mythology and different cultures that you don't even get to see in this book, but we'll probably get to see a lot more in later books. I feel like the footnotes actually worked quite well to give a feeling of depth and lore and things that weren't even really relevant to this book, but that the characters know about. So I like that kind of thing where it feels like there's some depth to the world beyond the information that the characters need for the book that you're in. Of course, authors can take that way too far. The political setup in here is that you have a mostly immortal emperor and then some noble royal houses that are all scheming and, you know, murdering and stuff like that. But it was done in a way that it didn't feel like something that I had seen a billion times before. It also wasn't the most unique thing ever. I would say this is kind of like middle of the road world building to me today. Definitely some originality went into it. There were some different races, including a race called the Vannae, which are kind of like elves, but they're, you know, beautiful and immortal. And I actually quite liked them. I've always liked elves anyway, but it felt like it was, you know, enough like elves that I enjoyed it, but not so much like elves that I thought I was in a D&D book. There were plenty of things about it that were not sort of Tolkien-y ripoff whatsoever. But it was still, I like those sort of immortal races and that kind of stuff. So that was cool. I feel like there were plenty of things that got introduced in here that could be used well in a later book, or they could just be color, and I don't know yet, and I like that. Slavery and the owning of slaves is a pretty big thing in this book, and it's definitely dealt with like the heavy topic that it is. It's something that's widely accepted and common in Kieran's world. It seems like it's a pretty big part of the economy, but you also have outsider characters that are discussing it and pointing out sort of the evils that it perpetuates on the entire society, and there are plenty of themes of slavery and consent and things like that that get explored in this book. In general, it feels like a world that has consequences. You know, the things that happen to characters and the things that happen in the society all do have consequences. You have a lot of convoluted family relationships. You have characters doing what they need to survive, but there also is sort of a underlying, I guess I would call it a good versus evil plot, except I don't have a really strong feeling about what's happening with it after the first book. But it does have some gods and epic stakes, as well as some small scale or smaller scale politics and nasty people. I overall feel like I've covered this, but I did like the characters pretty well. They weren't huge standouts, but there were some side characters I liked. I thought that Kieran was an okay protagonist. It was interesting having the perspective of him both from his own point of view as well as the third person narration. He was an overall, you know, not maybe the most fascinating character, like not super complex, but I was okay with him. I felt like I had a sense of who he was. I actually really liked the character who was doing the footnotes. Frobisher. You only really meet him like at the end of the book, but it was kind of fun to see him and his role in the story, which was very interesting. And after just seeing the footnotes the whole time and not really knowing who was writing them or why. So he's a character I really hope we'll see more of in future books. I did kind of like that there were a mix of antagonists that seemed like they were just, evil with neon evil signs, and some people that were just, in the end, they suffered consequences or didn't because they were people that made bad choices or even who just looked the other way when people around them were making bad choices. So that was kind of an interesting mix to me. A lot of times books go in one direction or the other. I find it interesting that I feel like this book is kind of doing both. It's like both good versus evil, if you can figure out which is which. And also everyone has a moral responsibility to not overlook like everyday evil. And there are also a lot of characters that I did not know how to feel about by the end of this book. So to wrap up, I feel like the beginning of the book promised this really awesome payoff that I don't feel like I quite got, but there were still things about it that were really cool. I don't know if I'm just still so excited by the beginning that I want to keep going. I feel like the ending was, was snappy. It kept me interested. It set up some stuff. I'm still intrigued. I'm not in love, but I'm definitely going to keep going with this series, at least for one more book. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I know this is a book that has gotten some very mixed reactions. So if you've read this or if you're interested in it, let me know your thoughts down in the comments.